Becoming a late diagnosed neurodivergent means, yes, you are part of a marginalized group in society. There are plenty of us who internalize everything when it comes to bias in society and stigma. We internalize it as our issue individually and not an issue with the system. Hello, welcome to the Trauma-Informed SLP. I just banged the desk that everything's sitting on, so that's fun. Hey, I'm Kim Neely, licensed speech language pathologist in the United States, and neurodivergent and queer, and, you know, let's unpack some stuff. But this is the official introduction to the systemic oppression side of my Venn diagram for Welcome to Your Late Diagnosis Neurodivergence. This whole series I'm doing. Woo! We're going to talk about system-oriented trauma and marginalization and things like that because I am so sorry to have to tell you this, although you probably already know. Becoming a late diagnosed neurodivergent means, yes, you are part of a marginalized group in society. And if you were already part of a marginalized group, yeah, you have another one to contend with. So, welcome. So exciting. Sarcasm. That's why I gotta talk about this a little bit, because this is the stuff that I think, I honestly think a lot of younger neurodivergents might be starting to figure this stuff out more so than those of us who are late diagnosed, especially those of us who are white and late diagnosed. And it's important to talk about because it is a critical part of our experience in the world, of how we try to fit into the world. It sometimes explains some of our behaviors that we have, like if we have a bit of a fawn response, like you might have seen in my unmasking video. I'll link that. I hear my dog coming. There she is. What a good girl. You want to go outside? She has some very important guarding of the house from squirrels to do out there. Now, to be fair, I know like online discourse around marginalization is a hot topic and people have very divisive opinions on just even using the word marginalized group or minoritized group, But this is not to say, like, if you think, oh gosh, victim complex stuff, that's not what I'm talking about. I just want to talk about the realities of the way the world we're living in, how it's structured, and how it impacts those of us whose brains are not wired in such a way that makes it very easy to navigate this world and understand this world. Me being one of them, okay? And I think a lot of us, like I said, fellow white people, we tend to have a really big issue with, we don't really receive education around the idea that there's marginalization, the idea that systems and structures are not made for us because white identities in the United States are what's centralized. That's what we see represented the most. That's what our systems are built for. They're the ones who started this country, right? Founding fathers, white, So we don't get this sort of education. And I do think it's a really important part, especially if you're a parent of a neurodivergent. And I keep saying that because a lot of people receive their diagnoses as adults because their kid got diagnosed and they start to see the same behaviors that they had. And they went, wait a second, hold on a second. I think this is why it's important to talk about, because a lot of treatment paradigms for neurodiversity affirming things and stuff tend to fail to address the fact that, like, there's a lot of times, depending on where you're living and the type of people you're around, your neurodivergent kid might not be able to avoid bullying, right? You as a neurodivergent adult might not be able to avoid implicit bias that pushes you out of jobs, right? Or having people unwilling to accommodate your needs, right? These are things that is good to understand and know about because there are plenty of us who internalize everything when it comes to bias in society and stigma. We internalize it as our issue individually and not an issue with the system. And it's important, I think, to think about the system, that little bit of a meta level, okay? So kind of going up from individual experiences, individual relationships, and moving up to system, like society at large. Bigger meta, if you were a sociologist or you ever took a sociology class, we're talking that level, okay? We're talking the study of societies, right? So this stuff definitely trickles down to individual experiences and individual relationships and how people talk about things and understanding each other and all that kind of stuff. And intersectionality, absolutely. But I'm going to keep it kind of more of this system level for right now. First off, there's certain precepts that we need to accept when we talk about social marginalization of groups. We have to accept that our society is effectively structured in a hierarchical system, like a ladder or a pyramid or whatever, okay? I don't think it takes a whole lot of effort at this point in time in the United States. I really hope it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to prove to people that at least economically, we're in what's effectively a pyramid scheme, essentially. Like the entire freaking economy right now feels a little grifty, because we've got all these billionaires that are hoarding so much freaking wealth, so much wealth. So in trauma-informed care, it's really important to understand societal contributors to trauma, because being marginalized, being at the bottom of society is a traumatizing position to be in any society that has a hierarchy like this, that's built the way ours is. And the way I look at it is, if it's trauma-informed, it means it applies to all humans across all of human history. That's how I look at it, because trauma is a thing that's specifically studied in humans. It should apply to all of us, right? So this is why I started looking into different social hierarchies and different positions and values in tribal cultures versus feudalism. Okay. So this is where I'm getting to the actual thing. Caveats over. I'm bridging it over into the actual topic here. So from what I can tell, globally speaking, pretty much every society that entered into feudalism as a stage, usually due to agriculture, because once people were able to acquire food sources, if you could acquire the control over the food, you could be the top dog of society.
That means if you own the farm, you own a lot of food, which is something everybody needs to survive. So that makes you king.
So feudalism, any society that entered into feudalism had some kind of hierarchical societal structure, meaning they had a lower class, they had the aristocracy or the royalty at the top, right? And then they might have had some sort of middle, sort of people sort of in the middle, people sort of adjacent to the aristocracy, like warriors and generals, because they hold a lot of power. They probably got a lot of money and land and got rewarded by the nobility, right, for their contributions. And so they were another high level class in society versus the actual farm workers, the actual people in the field who were out there in the sun all day and got really dirty and all of this and probably very sweaty and all that. So they were lower class. And you have servant class, you have slaves, you have that sort of stuff. And what I mean by global is, this is present in Asian countries prior to any interaction with Western cultures. So prior to any colonialization or anything, you still see this in the history of the way their society was structured if they entered into a feudal state, okay, at some point. And I say that also to qualify that we do need to acknowledge that there are still plenty of societies on this planet right now that never went to feudalism. We have plenty of nomadic and tribal type communities, and their social hierarchy and the way they think of social norms is incredibly different compared to cultures that went into feudalism, essentially. Okay? This is why I always talk about social hierarchy, because white supremacy culture, for example, is a form of social hierarchy. Colonialism is essentially forcing the oftentimes British English, usually, right? It's usually England. in our current time, most colonialism was done by England. Some other European countries too, especially in Africa, but a lot of it was England. And so they enforced their hierarchical rules on the population that they colonized, right? So these are all forms of this hierarchy. And the current status for many, many countries around the world is that white colonialism is the real source of most of these issues with this hierarchy. And so you hear about that a lot. But when I'm thinking globally and throughout human history, I tend to think of it in that even broader term of just thinking of the hierarchy. Okay. Now, this hierarchy has been existing, like I said, since feudalism. Feudalism has been existing in societies and civilization for a very long time. So we've had millennia to establish these norms in our brain of some people are just better than others, right? Some people are just more deserving than others. Some people are just blessed by the gods to have wealth, right? Or whatever. Some people are God ordained into their position, right? This is sort of the idea around that. And it's all just taken different flavors, I think, over the millennia and definitely over the last century, right? We don't really want to believe that, a leader of a country, or say like the Nepo baby CEO of a multi-billion dollar company is God ordained. We might not believe that. Some people might, but maybe general public wise, they don't believe it. But they might believe something like, well, they're just a whole family of geniuses. It's their genetics. They're so smart. You might believe something like that, right? We've essentially just changed the way we talk about what makes them deserving of all the billions and billions of dollars compared to the rest of us, right? We've just changed the wording around it, all right? They're either more talented or more genius or what have you, right? But it's still essentially the same thing. So this is just more of a pattern recognition thing, but when you look at feudal societies, you look at their structure, you look at like the monarchy, the aristocracy, the warrior class, and then like worker class people, like peasants, serfs, that kind of stuff. And you look at like capitalism, for example, especially late stage, where you have like the uber wealthy, right? You have the like billionaire class, the like extreme wealth, right? You have elected officials, you have the politicians, right, who get paid off a lot of times by the uber wealthy. You have the higher class people, like, people who make like $500,000 to $1 million a year or something, high class, right? Maybe top 1% of workers, and you have like certain bureaucrats, like your state politicians, maybe per se. Like some of them might be billionaires these days, but they could also just be your sort of standard high class. And then you have everybody else, right? Then you have workers. And in our society, we have like the white collar workers who get salary, and you have the blue collar workers. And that used to associate with levels of income, but it actually doesn't really these days. There's plenty of white collar jobs that do not pay that much at all. And there's also blue collar jobs that actually pay decently well because there's a lot of high risk to them and not everybody wants to do them, right? And for the longest time, the uber wealthy were not as distant in terms of the amount of wealth acquired, right? This is a more last 45 years or so, they've been acquiring more and more and more and more and more. But, in the 1950s or so, it wasn't nearly as big of a gap, right? But you still have, if you're outside of that class, I know for myself, it's like trying to understand just the thinking and the type of access to all the resources they have up there at that class is like, it's insane. It's insane, right? That they can spend millions of dollars in a blink of an eye, like the way that you would spend $5 at Starbucks. You know what I mean? Like, it's just absolutely mind-boggling when you look at the sheer amount of wealth. Like, they can just buy a private jet the way you buy a coffee, like, whew, that is an astounding level of wealth. But that's part of the problem, though, is the rest of us don't even know. It's nearly impossible to conceptualize what life would be like at that level, such that we just spend a lot of time infighting down here at the lower rungs of who has more, instead of like, hey guys, no more private jets, okay? We need money for food, for example. That would be great. So that is the premise upon which, thinking of a social hierarchy, this is the premise upon which we bring in the idea of privilege and power differentials in society. Because we have this sort of pyramidal type structure with the very small population of people at the very tippy top being the like uber wealthy top, the uber powerful, uber wealthy folks, and everybody else that falls below them, we do have people who hold way more power than the rest of us. And we obviously know this in the United States right now because we have leaders in this country doing a lot of things that the majority of Americans do not want and do not agree with on both sides of the political aisle. And they're still doing it anyway, And that's because we don't really have, the power, or we do have the power to stop them, but it requires probably a lot more organization and collectivism than we currently have at the moment, right? I think we're kind of getting there, honestly. I'm a little hopeful that we're going to get there, hopefully. But yeah, like, it's astounding, right? That like we can sit there and protest the genocide in Gaza, for example, over and over and over again, and nothing really changes, right? Because our leaders, the people who are holding the purse strings and holding the resources that could help Gaza, are not paying a lick of attention to the majority of what most of us want, right? So, and also they're like trying to politicize being anti-genocide. Like, really, guys? We're going to politicize being against the eradication of an entire ethnicity or race of people or type of people? Like, that is some seriously dystopian shit right there. I try not to cuss, but I just feel like I have to right then. Anyway, okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox and get back to the topic. But all right, so when you have this power differential, now you get into the concept of privilege. And now privilege is both individual and systemic, really, okay? Because there's lots of different types of privilege in terms of how we're treated in society, right? Some of the privilege is very static. So like your skin color is a pretty static, relatively static. I know there's been people who've done like excessive things to try to appear like a different race, but in general, right? That's a fairly static thing. You know, your neurotype is pretty static, right? You can't like completely change your autistic brain or your ADHD brain. It is what it is. It's going to do what it does. If you think you can fight your ADHD and win, you can't, because the ADHD is you, okay? It's how your brain functions. You can't fight your brain with your brain. Does that make sense? Brain against brain, established brain is probably going to win. Okay, so we have that. And then we also have some fluid privilege. Like for some people, wealth status can change. And that can go both directions, wealth status, right? You could have people who are really well off, but then, you know, they're one medical crisis away from bankruptcy in this country because that's how the United States works too. So it can go both ways. You can both acquire wealth, or which is harder to do in this country, getting harder and harder by the year, essentially, or you could lose it, right? So that's a fluid status. The abilities of people, whether you're able-bodied or not, that is fluid and changeable. If you have the privilege of living into your elderly years, you likely will be losing mobility. At some point in time, you will become more disabled, okay? If not really truly officially disabled, all right? You might have some level of disability as you age. That's just how aging works. It's the privilege of getting older, okay? So there's lots of different ways, and I have this little image, the Sylvia Duckworth image of the Wheel of Power and Privilege I'll probably put up, which I might have already put up. You might already have seen it. But essentially, that's a way to think about it. The more centralized you get, essentially, the higher up you are on this like social hierarchy. So kind of think of it as like, I wish I could get some sort of graphic that shows this, but if you're you look at this wheel, think of it like you're looking down on like a cone, okay? Like it's actually more of a conical structure, and those in the middle up have more power. They're higher up in the hierarchy of society than those down below, okay? And this gets at intersectionality because you can kind of look at where you're more centralized in certain identities versus others, right? And the more you have that gets you closer to power, the higher up you are, the more power you have in society compared to, and the more society is built around you, essentially, versus people who have a lot of marginalization on the outskirts. They're at the bigger, like lower part of that societal, like kind of cone or mountain or pyramid or whatever. This is an important thing to understand because I think there's a lot of people, you know, if you are a neurodivergent, let's say you're cis, white, straight man who grew up in a fairly privileged household, like wealth-wise, sure. Let's just say, you know, this person could still have a lot of individual adversity, like maybe emotional neglect, maybe abuse, sure. But for the sake, let's just say systemically, societally, they have all this privilege. But it turns out they actually are autistic and they were never diagnosed as such. Or maybe they were and the parents hid the diagnosis, which does apparently happen sometimes, which is like kind of sus. So although this guy lived, you know, he was given the message societally that he should have access to like everything, right? It should be fairly easy for him to walk into success. Maybe it's never been easy because he's autistic and he's a little weird. And so he was always facing a lot of societal rejection. Maybe it was hard for him to be successful at a job. Maybe it was really difficult to be successful at a certain graduate program or a degree program or something to get him to a level of where his parents was or something, right? Maybe he's struggling with managing money the way his parents manage it. Maybe he can't keep the house as clean as his parents could keep it. And like, there's all these ways he's falling short of these societal expectations for someone in his position, right? And not understanding that the reason he's falling short is more due to societal stigma and bias, and like the fact that those expectations are based on what we would call a neurotypical expectation. That's why he's failing, right? But then this guy grows up feeling like he's the reason that he's failing so terribly, terribly much, right? And maybe despite his best efforts, he can't get that. Well, now you have someone who's ripe for either really significant negative mental health impacts in the way of feeling a lot of internalized shame and depression and stuff, or externalizing that and feeling very angry at people and wanting to lash out, or, you know, maybe going down certain pipelines online or something and heading into very dangerous territory, possibly. That's something that could happen too. And they could also react in a very different way. It might not even be that. I don't know. But they probably have a lot of internalized feelings around like, I'm not good enough, but I should be, right? There's a lot of that. I should be more successful. I should be able to do these things, but I can't, right? And so somehow that failure gets internalized, right? And it can be a really bad thing just in general. There is research into what's called the minority stress model. And it's called, I know minority is not the ideal term for groups of people, but, you know, researchers are able to define a term the way they want. But minority stress model is something that came out, I think originally looking, I believe, transgender or possibly gay men. I can't remember, one of the two. But it's now been used to study the mental health impacts of being a minoritized group in society at large, both in the UK and I believe also in the United States. People have done some research on this, and I think it's branched out to other countries as well. But effectively, what a lot of this is showing is that if you do not consider systemic adversity and sort of this chronic cycle of striving for something and failing, and striving and failing, or trying to access something and being denied, or, you know, having to constantly look over your shoulder in terms of safety for, like, for example, people of color with police officers and stuff like that, right? If you don't take that into account with an individual's mental health, if somebody is depressed or suffering from some other type of like anxiety or depression, and you only look at the individual and you do not even take into consideration their position in society and their experiences in society, you are missing the biggest correlation with the mental health they have, with their concerns, with the way they internalize messages about themselves, with how they feel their identity within society. You're missing out on all of that because it has an impact, essentially. Living and trying to function in society while you're constantly being sent a barrage of messages about how much you fail and how horrible you are, and oh my gosh, you can't be on time, and that's just, you insulted me, or you manipulated me, or you whatever, you know, like, yeah, or you were just too much of a child, you can't be an adult, whatever it is people are sending out as the message, right? Or you should just talk more to people who have situational mutism. That's something I believe they get a lot too. And I've seen some of my students get that. And it's like, that's basically like looking at somebody in a wheelchair and being like, why don't you just walk? You know, it's like, that's just FYI. That's the vibe of telling someone with situational mutism, you just should talk. Well, you just need to learn how to talk. You better just talk. You're going to look at a wheelchair person and be like, you should just walk. Someone who's literally paralyzed or something. Or maybe they are an occasional wheelchair user and she'd be like, you should just not use it though, ever. It's like, come on. If you are the kind of person who's going to look at someone in a wheelchair and tell them they should just not use it, this is not the channel for you. You can move along. You will not agree with anything I say. Just saying that for sure. Them's just be the facts, okay? We're more about like understanding people's needs here and being compassionate and considerate and collaborative with those needs rather than like, you know, dismissive and all of that. So yeah, like whatever it is, those like, you should be this, you should be that, you shouldn't be this way, like these sort of messages, we receive it all the time. What a lot of societal stigma and bias really translate to is existing with a lot of dehumanization. Now, dehumanization, it usually does start with how people are talked about, how that group is talked about, but it's essentially the process of making that group less than human. They are less than other people, right? Kind of kicking them off the societal pyramid as much as possible, okay? Like calling a group morally inferior, calling a group dangerous, calling them criminals, calling them, illegals. That's a pretty dehumanizing phrase, actually. When they try to say trans people are like groomers or something or pedophiles, no, absolutely not. Neither are drag queens. Absolutely not. So essentially, when you get into dehumanization and microaggressions and things like that, microaggressions being like these little ways that are so normal for people to oftentimes the people doing a microaggression might not even be aware that what they're doing is microaggressive, but like they might, it's the death by a thousand cuts thing. It's like the idea of like, like as someone in a female body, someone in a woman's body, like always getting the messages around like, you need to diet, you're not skinny enough, or you're not tall enough, you're not pretty enough, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need this, you need that, you should be doing this for yourself, right? You're getting too old, you're not attractive anymore, blah, blah, blah. Like all these messages, these are all these little teeny cuts to our psyche about who we are in the world and our value that we bring to the world. And, and it's in how you see, like for the sexism part, like the way women are portrayed in movies, the way they're portrayed, the actresses, the expectations for actress bodies and their physicality, right? And that kind of stuff, right? This is all part of that dehumanizing, microaggressive, just picking and picking and picking and picking at a person and telling them they're not good enough and they're not worth something, right? So a lot of this stuff comes in the form of, depending on what the group is, you get like things like slurs, right? You get racist terminology, you get sexist stuff, right? I call those that, you get the little ists in there, right? Sexism, racism, colorism within people of color. And you get all of those sort of things. You also have what I like to call the faux phobias, because as Aubrey Gordon stated once on Maintenance Phase, and she's 100% legit about it, actual phobias are actual genuine mental illnesses that we really shouldn't be like stigmatizing, quite frankly. So like if you're arachnophobic, that's actually a mental health thing that can be debilitating. Faux phobias being like homophobia, queerphobia, fat phobia, right? These are just the ways we talk about these things. But these are all terms people use to describe ways that that society tells them they're not good. They're not good enough. They shouldn't be in society. They shouldn't exist, right? Because they're not good enough for our society. And it becomes an us versus them thing, right? And ableism is another one of the like isms there, right? And that's a term for not like seeing disabled people as less than, okay? And that's another reason why this is important to understand, because we've all received very different messages. And we're going to get into things like internalized ableism, internalized oppression, just in general. So anytime one of those things I just talked about, racism, sexism, colorism, transphobia, anytime you internalize that message, right? So you are of that group, but you're trying to say, I'm a good one of that group. It's sort of the leopards won't eat my face kind of thing, right? I'm the model version, and those people need to stop being that other way of being in this group. They're not good enough for my group. We'll get into that in a little bit. I'll probably do a separate video on internalized oppression, but it'll come up a fair amount. It's when we start to internalize the messages, these anti-us messages we've been getting in society. We start to internalize them and feel that they're real, right? We start to feel like, yeah, you're right, I'm not skinny enough. You're right, I should diet more. You're right, I should, do XYZ instead of this, right? That's internalizing that message, okay? These things impact our psychology because humans are communal animals. We need to belong to a community. That is like a biological urge we have that is very, very, very important for the majority of humans on this planet. We need a community to feel safe because we are communal creatures, because prior to feudalism, prior to all of this stuff, we still banded together to survive against the world. That's how humans worked. And all of these little teeny messages that chip away at our feeling of being safe is just more and more of a sign to our survival mode brain, our midbrain area, which I did a whole thing on trauma for autistics. I'll link that. Look for the thingy wherever it pops up. I don't know which corner it is. But essentially, our little midbrain area, our little limbic system, our emotional system, our little amygdala up in our brain that's trying to assess whether things are threats or not, right? If somebody says something that makes it clear that they don't respect us, don't like us, don't want us to be in their presence, right? It tends to feel fairly unsafe. And there's good reason for that, because as a communal species, we rely on each other to protect each other, right? So an emotional or psychological feeling of not being safe, our body and our brain are going to react the same as a physical threat, essentially, to our safety, because it could very easily become that if we were still in this like tribal sort of vibe where if they started having a food shortage, for example, maybe you would be the first person they would stop allowing food, for example, right? If there was like a famine, maybe you would be the first person that they would push out and say like, nah, we don't actually want to feed you. Not you. You're not that useful, right? Or we don't like you that much, right? You're voted off the island or whatever. That kind of vibe, right? And that obviously is dangerous. Obviously. And our brains have evolved to start to figure out and assess where we have those sort of threats. So it's very real, is what I want to say. The weight, the feeling, the psychological impact of feeling the stigma and the bias and all the messages we've been fed, that psychological weight is very real. Okay? It's a very real thing. It's a very valid thing, quite frankly, because it has a lot to do with just how humans are intended to function, how we've evolved to function in our world. It doesn't make you a broken, completely wrong person, right? But unfortunately, it does mean there's a lot for us to unpack, you know? And it creates a lot of misunderstanding, and it creates a lot of troubles and barriers within interpersonal relationships and careers and schooling and access to certain systems. Like it creates a much harder thing. And then we're using so much energy to try to navigate the world that we're burnt out and exhausted way before other people are, you know? And so it has real consequences, and it's a true thing to have this adversity. It doesn't make you're not necessarily stuck in victim mentality just by acknowledging that it takes you more effort to navigate the world and to navigate relationships than other people, than more general population, neurotypical people. That's not a victim mentality to acknowledge that exists. And also, it's totally valid to have feelings about the fact that it exists. Just also want to share that. It's valid to be angry about it. It's not valid to lash out at people. It's not valid to be violent against people because of it. That's not valid. But it is valid to be angry. It's valid to be sad, to grieve the fact that you don't get the easiest path in life compared to other people. Like that's completely valid. If you need to take a moment to grieve that, you know? For me personally, I always, at this point, now that I've sort of awakened, if you will, to this knowledge, it's like I kind of have this like low-grade simmering anger about it pretty much all the time. Sometimes I vent that anger with like-minded friends who are safe, and we vent and we, you know, we stereotype and we have a little bondy, like just venting it all out experience just to get it out of our systems. Otherwise, it just goes back to low grade simmer, you know? Because I don't know what else to do with it. It just sort of sits there. Because it doesn't go away, because society doesn't change. So, best I do is I give it a little bit of time, a little bit of space to actually feel it. And then I have to kind of just leave it on its own to simmer and just stop, you know, ignore it. Just let it hang out. And go focus elsewhere and have other feelings dominate, essentially. Have more like hope or joy or, you know, fun or whatever. That's the best tip I've got. I don't know. I don't have a whole lot of tip. But this is where I get at with neurodivergence. I think one of the biggest things for us is trying to find the sense of having access to a safe community. It's really important in terms of recovery, mental health-wise, from things like systemic trauma, because community is where we attain that sense of being looked after and to start to heal from that survival mode we're in when we feel like nobody has our back. and we always have to look after ourselves all the time, right? So we have to have even just the tiniest little bit of like a safe place to be with other people. And it's challenging as neurodivergents though, because we all have differing sensory needs, we all have differing perspectives. It's such an incredibly diverse, we all have different intersectionalities as well. We all have so many differing needs and differing things, and it's such a diverse community. I like to say it's a little analogous in a way to the queer community, of which there's a fair amount of overlap between queers and neurodivergents, just want to say. But it's similar to that in the sense that you could be any race, any ethnicity, any religion, from any country, any orientation, any queer identity or not. You could be any of these things and still be neurodivergent. So we have all of everybody showing up here. And then we also have people with more apparent disabilities or people with non-apparent disabilities within the same community as well. So it's like, it's a lot, right? And I don't think we can ever expect every single neurodivergent to get along with each other. That is not an expectation. There will be plenty of neurodivergents that like, they're not going to be like your tight knit, you know? They're not going to be your jam. They're not going to be people you want to be around all the time. Totally valid. Everybody has that. That's not just a neurodivergent thing. That's a neurotypical thing too. We all have to be kind of selective, especially as we grow older and learn more of what our needs are and our boundaries and such, right? But acknowledging and realizing that we're all struggling with similar stigma and bias, I think is a good place to start to unpack some of these things, to help us to advocate for ourselves, and then also to advocate for safer spaces for us to just hang out and exist without bringing in societal expectations that can be harmful if we don't get some sort of relief and essentially vacation. Essentially, we need little community areas, whether they're online or in person. We need little spaces where we can just get a little vacation from having to feel like we need to be normal. You know what I mean? We gotta find places where we can just be a bit weird and just kind of chill with our little weird cringy selves. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I think this is important to address, and it's important to understand and to know and to start to unpack. So I think that mostly wraps up this whole systemic oppression thing with a little bit of dose of internalized oppression, which I might get into a little more, but minority stress model apparently is really where you get into more of that internalized oppression stuff, really, and how it really impacts us psychologically, and it definitely has an impact on accessing a safe community of people within that particular societal group, because the internalized oppression can definitely, it kind of can create a lot of infighting essentially within the group. So ableism is definitely something that we got to get into, ableism and internalized ableism, and then considering intersectionalities within all of this stuff too, right? Because as an individual, you are a combination of all your identities plus experiences in society as those identities. So we all have very different experiences and different things that stick out and different things that affect us in different ways, right? And one of the things in the, for example, like the autism community, for example, online, I feel like there is an overrepresentation of white autistics to the point where there's often this like just lack of knowledge around and failure to acknowledge that autistics of color have very different experiences in society and very different needs when it comes to the ability to possibly mask around certain people or to switch into certain behaviors that hopefully will keep them more safe from certain authority figures, especially in the United States, like the police. You know, there's a lot of other considerations there that white autistics and parents of white autistics and white parents of autistics don't quite get, right? That do absolutely need to be acknowledged. I'm not going to speak on them a whole lot because I'm white. You know, for those who might have visual impairment, yeah, I'm pretty white. I'm like Irish white. I'm like, I don't even tan white, okay? If you put a spray tan on me, I would probably look kind of ridiculous, quite frankly, honestly. If you have something else that you want to offer as something for me to talk about, please put it in a comment below. Let me know if there's a particular topic that's on your mind or a particular thing you're struggling with or a concept you're struggling with. I have my own list of videos to make, but I would love to take some suggestions from you guys and help unpack certain things for you as much as I can within my knowledge and my scope of practice and that sort of thing. With all that said, world is tough. Whew, take a nice long breath. Go outside, take a walk if that helps you feel better. Watch some funny animals or something, or some cute things, whatever you need to do. Give yourself a little break today, a little brain rest, a little nugget of joy and happiness. It goes a long way to take little breaks like that throughout your day. And I will say, I will leave that with, in the effort to build our community and use our weirdness powers for good, I wish for you all to keep it weird. And until next time, guys. Hey, yeah, so I'm too weird for algorithms, guys. So comment, like, subscribe, do all those things to help these videos to get out to more people. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.